Hi, this is DrClyde, and we're on step 2 of 6 on optimizing your sports nutrition in this mini course. And our next step is the flow of calories, the importance of that to healing, therefore staying healthy in the face of your hard training to avoid overreaching symptoms or overtraining symptoms. So let's take a look at what the recommendations are briefly for carbohydrate and protein that contributes to your caloric intake, but then focus on calories on that for just a few minutes before we circle back to the macronutrients that make up those calories. So we're going to consider the recommendations that are published in the references in front of you on this slide from the IOC, International Olympic Committee, ISSN, the International Society for Sports Nutrition, and the American College of Sports Medicine, together with, at the time, the American Dietetics Association, the dietitians of Canada. And then there's a review paper that combined these in 2013, which of course didn't include any references more recently than that, such as the ISSN's publication on sports nutrition in 2019. So as a quick summary, not to go into any details, we'll do that in the next video on the recommendations on carbohydrate and protein from these organizations. You could see that with the National Institute of Medicine and the World Health Organization recommending around 0.6 to 0.8 grams per kilogram protein per day for health, just baseline health needs, that this goes up to 2 or even 3 times that level with high levels of training. So you could use potentially and assemble as much as 3 times your baseline protein needs without exercise when you're exercising with a very intensive, high volume training regimen. And the ranges are slightly different for the 3 governing bodies that are making recommendations, anywhere from 0.8 to 2, or 1.2 to 1.7, 1.3 to 1.8 grams per kilogram per day. But really, in a nutshell, they're doubling and at the most tripling your baseline protein need. It's even if your sleep is great, you're managing stress really well, your nutrition's amazing, you're going to have a really hard time getting past 3 times baseline in protein production. And so that gives you a maximum total daily grams of protein based on your weight that your cells are able to assemble and therefore heal in response to a training load. And if you divide by 24 hours, that gives you a sense of how much your lean tissue is able to produce in protein on an hour-by-hour basis, right? So you can estimate your daily needs, divide by the hours in your day, and then multiply the hourly need by how many hours between your meals to get a sense of how much to put in each individual meal, and then choose protein sources that digest slow enough to last until that next meal so that you have a steady stream of amino acid availability, so your body never has to go to your muscle tissue to get amino acids for more vital organs because of a deficit in protein or amino acid levels in your bloodstream. And that same protocol or approach should be used for carbohydrates. And notice that the carbohydrate recommendation from the ACSM, ISSN, and IOC are 3 or more times higher than protein recommendations, because we can deplete carbohydrate to a greater extent than we can damage protein and have to heal from it, right? You could burn as much as 1,000 calories an hour in a hard workout for at an athletic level of fitness, but you're not going to damage that same number of calories of protein. And so the demand for carbohydrate as a fuel source can be significantly higher than the demand for protein for healing. Now, bigger picture, stepping back from macronutrients and just looking at calories, you can see how these different organizations use different approaches to give a sense of how many calories an athletic person might need. The ADA and ACSM use a multiplier by your resting metabolic rate, which for most athletic individuals is going to be in the 2,000 to 4,000 calorie range. But we know that athletic individuals can burn as many as 10,000 calories a day, like the toughest stages at a high level cycling race, or in Navy SEAL Hell Week, right? I mean, there's a lot of different examples of ferocious levels of output where the human body can expend 10,000 calories a day. But in general, for year-round, reasonably high levels of training, it's going to be half that or even a little less than half that, maybe only a third of the maximum output that an athletic person could do in one day. So the IOC bases it more on kilograms, but it's a body weight as opposed to resting metabolic rate. But you can see it comes out to about the same range. And the ISSN just makes up a chart based on how hard you're working out and whether you're heavier or lighter as an athletic person. And the range ends up being much larger, up to the 10,000 calories that I was just talking about, or even more for a larger athlete. But this really masks the importance of timing, right? It's looking at the now when we get the carbohydrate and protein recommendations from these organizations, you're going to see that they are recommending dosing nutrients throughout the day. So it's clear that they are promoting the concept of nutrient flow for steady healing. But what happens if you don't have a reasonably even flow through your day, where you're not eating much in part of your day and then compensating for that by eating more later in another part of your day, even if your total calories are fine? Well, here's what happens. There is a downside. If you spend too many hours not healing because of a low calorie flow, of course, it's ideal that the macronutrients within those calories are healthy and supplying your cells what you need. But we're just starting with calories for the moment. If your calorie flow is low in part of your day, then your healing will be less, and your body might not be able to compensate for that in the rest of your day where you're eating more. And so these are a few papers representative of dozens that have come out over the last several decades. And you can see I'm referencing here a couple that are more recent, and then one that goes back to 2000. There were already papers on this earlier showing that if you're in a deep calorie deficit for more than a few hours per day, that you can have athletes with a lower resting metabolic rate and going up in body fat by as much as 0.3% for each hour that they delay eating enough. And in female athletes can have reduced menstrual function and potentially amenorrhea just because there's not and in males, low testosterone levels. So the steroid hormone complex for a reproductive system can be low in both male and female athletes. Just because of having more than a few hours per day where you're in a deficit of too many calories. So what is too many calories? What is too deep of a deficit? Well, every fourth of your 24-hour day, so every 6 hours, if you use up about a fourth of your daily calorie needs, it'll be a little less than that while you're sleeping, a little bit more than that while you're awake, then every 6 hours that you're in the fasted state, your body will be in a deficit by about a fourth of your needs. So when you eat a meal, your body will be in the fed state for, if it's a healthy, slow digesting meal, for 6 to 8 hours. That's where the time clock of being fasted starts. So we're not going to start the clock of fasting when you're eating or just finished eating. We're going to start it where you're physiologically fasted, where the body's starting to struggle in not having enough nutrients. Now that's great because it gives you a cellular cleanse. Your cells will start to clean up damaged proteins, etc. And so your lysosomes are the janitors for that. But that's the time clock, time zero for where fasting starts. And 6 hours into the fast, which starts after the nutrients are gone from your last meal, you're at 1/4 into your deficit. If you go deeper than 1/4 in your deficit, more than 6 or so hours into the fasted state, that's where you're eating up healthy proteins that your cells need instead of healing. And this pulls you backwards, and you might not be able to compensate for that. So 3 to 4 hours in to beyond that 6 hour fasted state is where you see these negative side effects in athletic individuals. And on a separate note, if you look at my other mini course just on healthy eating for healthy weight gain, maintenance, or weight loss, that the same is true for non-athletic, sedentary, but healthy people. There's a UCSF study showing that people who skip breakfast for intermittent fasting lose twice as much muscle mass than body fat. So these ideas apply to all human people, all human bodies, not just athletic or sedentary, but both, and the full spectrum in between. So the typical pattern is to go if you imagine this chart, the full vertical scale is however many calories you're burning in a day, whether that's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, doesn't matter. Whatever that is, that's the full vertical scale of the graph. And there's a slippery slope down to a deficit by however many calories that is at the end of 24 hours. So the x-axis is time, 24 hours. So if you eat nothing, you go all the way down to the bottom in the lower right. Well, a typical training pattern for an athletic person is to work out first thing in the morning. Maybe there's a tiny breakfast, but not much. So you wake up 1/4 in a deficit because you enter the fasted state somewhere in the night. And we wake up around 12 hours after our last meal, many people. So that's 6 hours in the fed state, 6 hours in the fasted state. So you wake up after being about 1/4 in a deficit. So if you don't eat in the first few hours, you won't be able to compensate for that later. But unfortunately, athletic individuals won't just, relax and do light activities in the start of their day. They'll often do their hard workout right at the start of the day. And so now, instead of being in a 25% deficit, the workout pushes them down by the same amount as they've gone down from not eating in the last 12 hours. So now you're in a 50% deficit. And those papers that I showed you on the last slide show clearly that it's a few hours in a 25% deficit that's a problem, or even just 1 hour in a 50% deficit. So waking up, barely eating anything, doing a hard workout puts you in a 50% deficit in a single hour, and will therefore give you overreaching, or which is short-term overtraining symptoms, just from not having eaten enough in that early part of your day, or whenever your workout occurs, right? Let's say you skip lunch so that you can have a hard workout in the afternoon, then the same thing will happen from that hard work out later on. And large, healthy meals later aren't going to get you back up to where you need to be to sustain a healthy body that is fit and can therefore contribute to maximum long-term performance. So the way to think of this, on the back of the envelope sketch or on a yellow sticky, you can just put a slippery slope line from the upper left to the lower right. That's your dip going down by your metabolic rate if you ate nothing over 24 hours. Put some up arrows for your meals and snacks, a down arrow for your workout, and then get a sense, do you think that you might be within that 25% deficit? If you're looking to go up in lean tissue, then you want to exceed that and go stay in the positive above this zero line, so that you can gain healthy weight over time. That workout, that down arrow that you just saw on the last slide, that might be mainly carbohydrate loss. And so if you're eating enough calories as protein and fats, that's still not replacing that carbohydrate. So your muscles could be starved even if you're overfeeding the rest of the body. And if you don't refuel and then get cravings later, and you're eating carbohydrates late at night in response to having too low a blood sugar during the hours where you didn't notice it, you weren't hungry, and then later it's hard to stop eating carbohydrate or stop eating in general, there's going to be an insulin response that increases your body fat, where you can have a body fat accumulation without overeating, where you're losing muscle mass and having an insulin response later, losing muscle mass from a low blood sugar, and then an insulin response that sends more calories to body fat, so that body fat is going up without overeating because of a low caloric flow followed by a higher caloric flow. So for example, you have hard exercise, drops muscle fuel levels in the reserves in there, which triggers a change in gene expression for an increase in fat burning, but that then down regulates healing, and eventually the loss in healing will reduce your fat burning. And I showed you that cell metabolism paper that was just published just a couple of years ago, where that already happens in the 3rd week of hard exercise for novices. So next, we will be discussing the breakdown of that caloric flow into by the macronutrients, starting with carbohydrate and protein.